remind yourself to wear those red flannels, Pat. Old man Winter's just around the corner.
Oh, I've got a mighty good reminder here, Tech. This repair order says the heater on this car isn't throwing enough heat. I've asked Ole to give me a hand with the job.
Ole, that's the new feller. Is he up on all the latest heater changes?
Probably not. But we can kill two birds with one stone. We can cover the improvements and operation of 59 heating systems and still give Ole a chance to learn by doing.
Just overheard that, Pat, and I accept your offer. What is the latest dope on 59 heaters?
Well, let's take them one at a time, Ole. Starting with the one on this car. The hot water heater. It's a full-time fresh air heating system with easy-to-use push-button controls. Buttons are identified off, low, high, DEF for defrost, and V for vent. Now, these buttons, Ole, actuate a combination vacuum and electrical control switch. There's also a sliding temperature control lever that operates the water valve by means of a wire cable. Now, perhaps the most outstanding new change is the use of a group of 3 vacuum actuators. Using vacuum from the engine manifold, the actuators operate doors and the damper in the heating system. Each actuator consists of 2 sealed chambers separated by a rubber diaphragm. Plastic hoses connect both actuator chambers with the control switch on the instrument panel. A sliding valve in the switch opens or vents to atmosphere one chamber of the actuator. The opposite chamber is opened to vacuum when the engine's running. Now, as the diaphragm moves to one side, a rod attached to it opens or closes a door or damper.
I see, Pat. Looks like a neat setup.
It is that, Ole, and operation's fairly easy to follow. Fresh air enters the cowl intake grill. It passes through the plenum chamber and rain trap and enters the heater core. From the core, heated air goes through the plastic housing and is drawn through a round hole in the dash panel to the right of the plenum chamber. As air enters the blower intake, it is discharged into the distribution duct.
That airflow is easy to follow. But can you fill me in on what happens when those buttons are pushed in?
Sure, Ole. Here's a sketch and an example. When the off button is pushed in, vacuum is applied to the sides of the actuators, as shown by the shaded hoses. The fresh air and shut-off doors are closed. The distribution duct damper is raised. The blower doesn't run since there's no completed circuit to the switch, so no fresh air circulates through the system. Now, when either the low or high buttons are pushed in, the electrical circuit is completed to the blower and there's either low or high blower speed. Also, vacuum is applied to the actuators to direct heated air as follows. The fresh air door is closed. The shut-off door is opened. The damper is raised and air discharges from outlet slots at the floor. Temperature is controlled by moving the sliding lever toward warm.
Let me see if I can guess my way through what happens when the defroster button is pushed in.
Go ahead, Ole.
Well, when the defrost button goes in, the vacuum actuators close the fresh air door and open the shut-off door, right?
So far, so good.
But I'll bet that distribution damper is moved down to send air up to the defroster outlets on top of the instrument panel, huh?
Right again, Ole. And the blower would run at high speed. I told you it was easy to figure out.
But pressing in the V, or vent button, is something different, my boy. Better let Pat tell you what happens there.
Okay. What is that vent story, Pat?
Well, when the vent button is pushed in, vacuum actuators open both the fresh air and shut-off doors. The damper is moved down. As a result, ram fresh air is admitted to the interior of the car through the fresh air door and through the distribution duct. Now, since there's no completed electrical circuit, the blower doesn't operate. The temperature control lever is in its off position. Now, this is a summer setting.
Clear enough, Pat. Now, what's up for us on maintenance?
Well, on reports of lack of heat or insufficient heat, it always pays to check the 4 main requirements of satisfactory heater operation. Engine coolant temperature, for one. Secondly, coolant circulation through the heater. Thirdly, there's air circulation through the heater core. And fourth, there's heater outlet air temperature. So let's start the engine and warm it up to normal operating temperature. Now, when the water temperature gauge needle's between the cold and hot marks, use a thermometer to check coolant temperature in the upper tank. The V8 engines use a 180-degree thermostat this year, so the thermometer should read at least 177 degrees.
If you were testing a six-cylinder engine with a 160-degree thermostat, you would read at least 157 degrees.
I gotcha. Well, our thermometer reads 177. We're okay so far, right?
That's right, Ole. So let's move the car outside and check outlet air temperature. It's about 40 degrees outside, and according to the table in this reference book, we should get air at about 149 degrees at the outlet. Before we take that reading, though, we'll have to run the engine at about 1,200 RPM for 10 minutes. The temperature control lever should be at its maximum heat setting and the defrost button pushed in.
Well, I don't know, Pat, but it looks like our heater outlet temperature's a good 20 degrees below the 149 degrees the chart says we ought to have.
Uh-oh. Anything more than 10 degrees under the reading specified calls for some additional checking. So check the control lever cable and see if it needs adjusting to get a greater opening of the water valve. If that doesn't improve the reading, we'll have to check water flow through the valve and the core.
Cable adjustment's not right, Pat. I'll change it to let the valve open fully. But if the cable had been right, how would you test the valve and core to see which was at fault?
Well, before we get into that, see if the heater hose from the top of the intake manifold is connected to the inner connection of the temperature control valve.
It's okay, Pat.
Good. Now we're ready to show you how to test the valve and core.
First, shut off the engine. Now use a rag to guard against scalding and remove the radiator cap.
Remove the heater return hose from the nipple in the water pump housing and plug the nipple. And run the water back into the radiator through a funnel. Now with this setup, you'll check water flow through both the valve and the core. We'll do it to show you how it works. I'll start the engine and run it again at 1,200 RPM. The temperature control lever is off, which should cut off water flow from the heater hose.
There's no water flow, Pat. The valve closes okay.
Good. Now I'm moving the control lever to its warmest setting to open the valve. Water flow from the hose should be at its greatest. If it isn't, we'll have to check the valve and the core separately to see which is at fault.
That's not the answer here. Water flow's good. So the valve and the core are okay, but how would you check each one separately?
You'd disconnect the outlet hose at the valve and flow test the valve. Then you'd flow test the core.
No need to worry on this job, though. Water flow is okay, and our outlet temperature is right. So, our work on this car is done. I'll shut off the engine.
We're done with this side of the record, too. Let's ask somebody to please turn the record.
Well, we were sort of lucky on that car, but this car is a horse of a different color. I've gone through the same steps, up to the point of flushing the heater core. So far, it hasn't helped.
I suppose we'll have to drain the heater core and flush it out, huh?
Right. So disconnect the heater hoses at the engine and at the control valve. Better save the antifreeze, because it's probably fresh.
Reverse flush the core with short bursts of water for about 5 minutes. Then flow water through at steady pressure for another 5 minutes. That ought to do it.
Check the condition of the hoses. If they are partially plugged or damaged, replace them.
No need to install new hoses, Tech. These are in fine shape and free from plugging.
Well, next, strain the coolant before you pour it back. Then we'll run the engine and recheck heater operation.
All right, will do. Outlet temperature's okay now, Pat, but there still doesn't seem to be enough airflow into the car.
Then we'd better check air circulation, beginning with the blower motor. Shut off the engine.
Check those motor connections, Ole. They must be clean and tight, same as any electrical circuit. Otherwise, that motor won't run fast enough. If the motor didn't run at all, we'd check for a blown fuse, naturally.
Nothing wrong electrically. No loose or corroded connections.
Well, that leaves only one possibility. The damper should be raised, the shut-off door should be open, and the fresh air door should be closed. If they're not positioned that way, disconnect the actuator rods at the doors and damper. Then, try to move the doors and damper by hand. If they move freely, then we'll have to check for a vacuum leak.
Well, I can move the doors and damper all right. No binding or interference anywhere. How do you make that vacuum check? With a gauge?
You just answered your own question, my boy. Start the engine. Remove both hoses from an actuator. One is vented to atmosphere, but the other should show vacuum pull. Install the gauge and see if you get manifold vacuum reading. Check each actuator that way.
And since I don't get a reading on this hose, it must be the guilty one.
Must be, Ole, because that actuator works the shut-off door. No wonder the heater didn't throw enough heat. And here's the trouble. This plastic hose is damaged. Shut off the engine. Replace the hose assembly. Install it carefully and fully on the actuator connections. Then we'll check airflow at the outlet.
Let her go, Ole. Installing that new vacuum hose really did the trick. We've got a full-fledged gale blowing out of here now.
Good news, Tech. That wasn't so hard to fix. Yeah, we can cross this job off as done. Hey, while we're on the car heating systems, we ought to talk about the heater section of the new air conditioning system. Also, the instant heater. Never can tell when one of those might come in.
Well, is the heater section of the air conditioning system much different?
Well, it's got some differences, all right, Ole. For one thing, 4 vacuum actuators are used in the combination cooling and heating unit. One actuator operates the fresh air and recirculating doors. These are so connected by adjustable linkage that when one door is open, the other is closed, and vice versa. Separate actuators also operate the heater bypass door, the distribution duct deflector, and the distribution duct damper.
Oh, then the flow of air is probably different, right?
That it is, my boy. But you'll find it a cinch to follow once you know what happens when certain buttons are pushed in.
The switch is like the other deal, a combination electrical vacuum setup, huh?
That's true, Ole. But the buttons carry different identification, and the blower switch operation is different. Instead of a high and low button for blower speeds, the sliding temperature control lever operates the blower switch. There are 2 types of switches used, 2-speed and 3-speed. The 2-speed switch provides low speed when the lever's pushed in, high speed when the lever's pulled out. And the 3-speed switch provides low speed when the lever's pushed in, pulled out to the first notch is medium speed, and all the way out is high speed.
What's max and fresh stand for?
Air conditioning controls, Ole. Max is maximum cooling, and fresh means fresh air cooling. You can forget those where car heating is involved.
Yeah, Ole. Let's take the defrost and heat buttons, for instance. When either one is depressed, it completes the circuit to the blower switch. Presto, circulation of heated air is provided.
Supposing the off button is pushed in.
Well, then vacuum operates the actuators that move the fresh air and heater bypass doors, the distribution duct damper, and the deflector. Shaded hoses on this sketch make that clear. In brief, Ole, the fresh air door is closed, the recirculating door is open, the bypass door is open, the damper is moved down, the deflector is moved up. Closing the fresh air door means no fresh air can be admitted. And since the blower isn't running, no circulation takes place.
Pretty clear, Pat. Now, how about the defrost button? How's that work?
Well, when the defroster button's pushed in, the fresh air door is open, the recirculating door closed, the bypass door is closed, the damper and deflectors are down. In this defrosting operation, air enters the fresh air door, goes through the evaporator and heater core, and then to the blower and into the distribution duct. Now, the damper channels most of the hot air to the defroster outlets. A small amount is discharged through the lower outlet. This proportion can be adjusted on most models by turning the knob on a control cable connected to the damper. You follow that?
Sure, Pat. Still with you.
Okay. Now, with the heat button in, you get the same actuator operation as defrost, except that the damper is moved up. In this position, all heated air is directed through the floor-level outlet. You can't adjust the cable to direct any air for defrosting when the heat button is in. Now, how much heat is delivered when either the defrost or heat button is in, naturally, depends on the control lever setting in its slot.
Here's something else. If you move the control lever to off, you can use the defrost or heat buttons to get fresh air circulation without heating or cooling the air.
I see. You can get almost any combination you want. I suppose that service on this heater section, then, is quite a bit different.
You suppose wrong. It's tackled a lot like the hot water heaters you just fixed.
Tech's right. Now, how about something on the new instant heater that delivers heat a few seconds after the engine's started?
Suits me, Pat. What's the dope?
Well, push-button controls of the instant heater are identical to those on the hot water unit. Heating, however, is done by a gasoline burner. Gas is pumped from the main fuel line and burned in the heater assembly. Fresh air from the cowl intake is drawn across the heat exchanger by a blower inside the car.
I get it. Air is warmed by being drawn across a heat exchanger instead of through a heater core.
Well, that's one basic difference, Ole. The doors, damper, and vacuum actuators still work the same as on the other heaters.
Any other differences, Ole, along with useful service tips on all heaters, are explained in this reference book. A little study on your part will do the trick. In addition, if you and all our technicians practice up on these heater procedures right now, our owners will warm up to us in more ways than one.